Deuteronomy chapter number 1, verse number 6, we're going to look at today. We see that Moses is talking in this moment. He's talking to the Israelites. He is reminding the Israelites of everything that they've been through. And they have been in the wilderness for 40 years. That's a long time, right? I haven't even been alive for 40 years, okay? That is a long time. So they've been in the wilderness for 40 years. He's rehashing this with them. He's telling them all the things that God has done, how he's been faithful. Because how many know in the midst of a wilderness experience, God is still faithful? In the midst of a time that is difficult, God is still faithful. So he's reminding them of God's faithfulness. He's telling them of all the things that God has done, sharing with them all the things that God has done. And he gets up to give this speech on the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year. Long time. And he gets up to give this speech and he's talking to them. And they're at this place called Horeb. And at Horeb, there is a mountain that they are stuck behind. And they've been there for about a year when he gives this speech. And it says in verse number 6, the Lord our God said to us at Horeb, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. Now, I don't know, but I think God might have brought somebody to church today, tuned in online, just to hear that. Like, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. You have stayed long enough where you're at. You have stayed long enough in this season, in this experience where you've been placed. You've stayed long enough. He says, break camp and advance into the hill country of the Amorites. Go to all the neighboring peoples in the Arabah, in the mountains, in the western foothills, in the Negev, and along the coast, to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the Euphrates. See, I have given you this land. Many of us are praying for God to do what he has already done. We're praying for God to move on something that he has already done. We're just kind of too busy worrying. Where are my worry words at? Like, you worry about everything, right? We're just too busy worrying to see that he's already done what we're praying for him to do. It says, go in, take possession of the land the Lord swore he would give to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to their descendants after them. Now, the Israelites here, they are stuck, right? They are at this mountain. And no doubt, many of us at some point in our lives, we have felt this way before, right? How many of you felt stuck before? We've all felt stuck at some point or another. Truthfully, many of us today may feel stuck where we're at. We feel stuck in this season. The Israelites, they appeared to be stuck. They appeared to be stuck in a place that they were not able to get out of, to not be able to get through it. And what makes matters even more discouraging for the Israelites is that they know that on the other side of this mountain where they are stuck is where what God has promised them is. Like, can you imagine how frustrating this had to be for them? To know that what God has spoken is on the other side of the place where they are stuck. To know what God said, but for that to not be what they see. To have this mountain, to have a hindrance, to have something that is blocking them from what God said. And whenever we get into these kind of moments, we can begin to feel and to think that we are stuck because of somebody else. Or we are stuck because of something else. Or we are stuck because of something beyond our control. Right? We love to play the blame game. I'm included in this. I love to play the blame game. I love to blame everybody else for the problems that I'm experiencing. However, the reality is many times we are stuck because we've chosen to stay stuck. We're stuck because we've chosen to be stuck. And God is telling the Israelites on this day, and I believe he's telling us today, that was not supposed to be forever. Where you are wasn't supposed to be forever. It wasn't meant to be forever, and you got to get beyond that place. So on this first week of Unstuck, I want to talk to you on this subject. It wasn't meant to be forever. It wasn't meant to be forever. Let's pray. God, I thank you for today. Thank you for every single person that's here. We thank you for your word this morning. Lord, I pray that you would prepare our hearts, that you would help us to remove all preconceived ideas, all preconceived notions, and to be open and receptive to what you have to say today. Lord, I pray that you would speak to us, help us to hear and see from you. Lord, help nobody to see and hear from me today. May you be glorified. May you be lifted up. We thank you for it in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. Now, how many of you are like this? How many of you fall asleep as soon as your head hits the pillow at night? Where are my instant sleepers at? All right, we got a couple. How many of y'all would say, I could stay up all night long if I didn't have to pay the consequences the next day? Oh, got some night owls in the place. All right, listen, I need my sleep. I can stay up. I don't like to stay up because I need sleep. I will get like physically sick if I have like 2 days where I don't get my 8 hours, okay? But my wife Nicole is you know, she falls asleep a little bit quicker than I do, okay? Like she's the type that she can just fall asleep no matter what. And she kind of lies to me every single night at bedtime, right? Because she'll say, oh, I'll be able to stay awake and watch the TV show, right? Because we're binge watching. And I'm not trying to binge watch on my own, because if I do, then she's going to get upset that I watched it without her. Then we got to rewind and go back and watch the last hour and a half that I watched on my own the night before. So I'll be like, hey, are you awake enough to watch this? She'll be like, yeah, I'm good. I'm good. And she is so amazing, and she does not lie. She's the most honest person I know, but she lies every night when she says she's good, okay? Because no joke, every single night, no matter what, 5 minutes later, I look up. 5 minutes later, it does not matter. Doesn't matter what time we got up that day. It doesn't matter if we've had a nap in the middle of the day. 5 minutes later, her head hits the pillow. She's out, right? And she's just asleep in the middle of the show. And so then I have to stop it. And I'm like, you know, I wave my hand in front of her. And if I wave my hand in front of her and she wakes up, she's like, no, I'm awake, I'm good. I literally have gotten to a point where I have to give her a lie detector test and say, okay, what just happened? And so she'll try to like see what's happening now and try to say, oh, well, they did this. I said, right, but what did they say before that? Right, a little interrogation, okay? Because she just falls asleep. She says that it's a clean conscience, okay? I think that it's just something like in her like family, right? Because our sister-in-law complains about her brother doing the same thing every night. She's like, every night he just falls asleep, like just as soon as they hit the pillow. I don't understand it. But I've been trying to figure out, like, are our boys gonna be this way, right? Or are we going to have night owls? Are they going to fall asleep easily? And we can't really tell yet, because our two oldest, they are in the same room. They have bunk beds together. And so I will put them to bed at night. While Nicole's dealing with the baby, I'll go and I'll put them to bed, get them tucked in, and I'll say, all right, good night. And they lie to me too. Because they'll look at me and they'll say, good night, Daddy. As if they are going to sleep. I don't think they realize that, like, the baby monitor in their room, I can see and hear everything that they're doing. Because they'll say goodnight, and then I'll go out. I'll even stand outside the door, and I hear Elijah go, Daddy thinks we're going to sleep, Judah. I'm like, come on, bro. So, like, they start jumping around. They start playing. They start making their animals, their stuffed animals, inanimate objects, they start making them come alive. And it's kind of fun to listen to, and I let them do it for a little bit. But then there comes a time when I have to, like, tell them it's time to go to bed. Like, for real. I'll talk on the intercom. I feel like when I do that, it sounds more like the voice of God or something. Like it, because Elijah will be out of his bed doing something, and as soon as I say, Elijah, get in your bed, over the intercom, he runs, and I just watch it on the screen. He runs and he jumps in the bed, like as if he's got, okay? So I'll just be like, it's time to go to bed. And they run and jump in. They're quiet for like a minute. And then they start all over again. It's just this cycle. And so finally, I get to a point where I know I'm the one that has to get them up and get them dressed the next morning and deal with their attitude, okay? I sound like such an old parent, but it's okay. It is what it is. So I'm like, y'all got to go to sleep right now, because I'm the one who has to, when I wake you up in the morning, I have to hear you say, too bright, it's too early, all this stuff. So I talk over the intercom again, and I'm like, the baby monitor, and I'm like, it's time to go to bed. Do not make me come up there and give you a spanking. I've never even had to do it, y'all. All I have to do is threaten it. My mom told all the stories about when I was a kid. All I have to do is say, don't make me come upstairs and give you a spanking. They get quiet. I tell them they're going to lose a privilege, like not being able to watch TV or eat a treat the next day. They get quiet. It's perfect. But 2 weeks ago, it was spring break. So I decided to let's just see what happens if they're trusted to go to sleep on their own. So I put them to bed. 5 minutes later, Nicole's out. But there was a game on, so I'm like, okay, I'm going to watch the game and just see how long it takes them to go to sleep. 2 hours later, the game is over. It's time for me to go to sleep, right? And I can't sleep the way that Nicole can with all the noise and commotion going on the baby monitor. So finally, I'm like, okay, it's been 2 hours. Like, they ain't going to sleep. So I just talked over the intercom and I said, boys, it's time. Eli goes, time for what? I said, boys. And when Eli says something, because see, Eli's the mischievous one, but then Judah cracks up laughing and it just pushes the envelope. So Elijah, the 3-year-old, he's like, time for what? And I said, it's time to go to bed. Eli says, Judah, are you going to bed? I said, it does not matter what Judah's doing. It is time to go to bed, right? But I told him, I said, it's time. Y'all been awake long enough. It is time. And this is exactly what God told the Israelites in this moment when they're at Horeb, at this mountain. He says, listen, it's time. It's time. You've been at this place long enough. It is time. And if you're taking notes today, you got a little sheet on the inside of your welcome packet. The first thing I want you to write down is it's time. It's time. God told them, he said in verse 6, the Lord our God said to us at Horeb, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. I want you to read that again. You have stayed long enough at this mountain. It says you have stayed. It does not say you've been held here. It does not say you were made to stay there. It says you have stayed long enough at this mountain. He's like, hey, you've been here long enough. You've been in this place long enough. You've been in this season long enough, and time is up. It is time to move on. It is time to get beyond this thing. And for some of us here today, it's time to get beyond the offense that we've been in for 5 years. It is time for us to get beyond the job that we settled for 2 years ago. It is time for us to get beyond the relationship that God has been telling us, that ain't it, but we've been staying there. And God is saying, it is time for you to get unstuck, to leave this place where you've been and to move on. God told the Israelites, he said, you've been here long enough. You have settled long enough. You've been in this place long enough. You've been in this moment long enough, and it is time for you to go. It's time to move beyond this thing. God told the Israelites, he says, listen, you're not stuck because you have to be stuck. You are stuck because you've chosen to be stuck. You're not stuck because somebody is forcing you to be stuck. You are stuck because you've made a decision, I'm going to stay right where I'm at. And we don't like to hear that in church, because in church we want to hear about how the enemy has held us back. But God needs some of us to know the enemy is not even concerned with you, because you've stayed stuck in a place where you have no power, because you haven't moved into the place God called you to. Once you get where God is leading you, then maybe the enemy will be concerned and he'll try to stop you. But right now in your life, you've chosen to stay where you're at. He told him, he said, listen, you are in the place you're at because you've chosen to be there, which is exactly what he's telling many of us today. It is time to move on. It is time to leave the place where you've been. Tell somebody, it's time. It's time. Because there is a difference, because I can hear everybody already. Well, I'm in a season of rest. Season of rest. Oh, it's so good. It sounds so holy, so good and spiritual. I'm in a season of rest. Here's the thing. Seasons of rest are great, but do not confuse rest with complacency. Everybody needs a season of rest from time to time. It is important. We even encourage it. Like here, when it comes to serving at Elevation Point, like we're not interested in anybody serving every single Sunday. Like we encourage you to take at least one Sunday off or 2 Sundays off. We need rest in our lives. But make sure you're not saying something is rest that is really just you being complacent. Well, I'm just resting in this job, even though I know it's not where I'm supposed to be. I know it's not what God has for me. I'm catching my breath. Been catching your breath for 5 years? Or have you become complacent? And have you allowed the gifts that God gave you to become something that you're sitting on because they're never going to get utilized where you're at? Well, I'm in a season of rest. Cool. But make sure that you're not confusing rest with complacency. Do not allow that season to become a lifetime. Do not allow the season to become the place where you stay. If you're going to see what God has promised, if you're going to see what God is going to do, then we cannot remain at Horeb. We cannot remain in the safety, in the comfort, in the place that's familiar. We have to be willing to leave that place and get beyond the mountain, get beyond the place where we've settled in complacency. It's time to move on. That's just what God was saying to me all week this week in preparing. He was just saying it's time to move on. And I believe a lot of it honestly was for me in my life because it's easy to become comfortable and it's easy to become complacent where you're at. Even as a church, it's easy to become comfortable with the way things are. It's comfortable because I know this person, or I know where the church is, and I know when I'm going to do this, and I know when I'm going to do that. And God said, hey, it's time to move on. It is time not to be complacent and comfortable where you're at, but to get beyond this thing. And many of us were like, but I'm scared. This week, I was like, God, I know we need to be moving on this situation, but I'm scared. Cool. But you've been here long enough. God, I don't, what if this, cool. But you've been here long enough. You've stayed at this place in your life long enough. You have stayed in this situation long enough. You've camped out in a place that you were only supposed to pass through. Camped out in a season that you were just supposed to be going through. And you've made it your life. And you've set up roots in a place that you were never supposed to set roots. And many of us were like, I know, like I have this relationship, and I know that you regret the way the relationship ended, but you've been here long enough. I know that you wish that you could go back and do things differently, but you've been here long enough. I know that you don't like what was done to you, but you've been here long enough. I know that you like the comfort of knowing what's going to happen and when it's going to happen and how it's going to be. We like to feel warm and fuzzy and comfortable, and that's great, but you've been here long enough. And God is saying today, it is time to move on. It's time to say, you know what? This is not where God called me to. The Israelites are at the mountain at Horeb, and they're so close to what God had promised, but they're stuck behind this mountain, and they've set up camp in a place they were never supposed to stay. And many of us have settled for a place and set up camp where we were never supposed to stay. We're like, well, I'm close enough. It's good enough. God's like, I have good plans for you. I have greater plans for you. I want to do above and beyond anything you could think or imagine. But we're like, I'm actually good here. I'm comfortable here. It's familiar to me. I like it. I know that person verbally abuses me every single day, but at least I know that they'll be there and they'll answer my call. I know that this job doesn't care anything about me. And God has said I was just supposed to develop the skills here so I could end up where I needed to be. But at least I know I've got a paycheck. I know that I really need to move beyond what that person did to me, and I need to forgive them and let it go. But I'm afraid that if I forgive them and let it go, that the good memories I had with them will go with it. And the good memories are the only time that I ever felt loved on this earth. God says, but you can never experience the true love that I have waiting for you if you keep staying at the same place. It is time to move on. It's time to move on. Some of us are like, hey, I regret eating those McDonald's cheeseburgers, the Chick-fil-A Christian chicken, maybe Christian chicken, but it's still It ain't grilled right. You know what I'm saying? Like the fried chicken is not grilled. The good sandwiches, the good stuff is not grilled, okay? I regret eating the ice cream. That's going to stop me from having a summer beach body. It happened, okay? You just got to let it go. But if we stay at these places in our lives, at these disappointments, or at these circumstances and situations, if we stay there, then we're not going to be able to experience or see what God is trying to do on the other side of it. And we're staying in places that God said, hey, I want you to pass through here. I don't want you to set up camp. I want you to pass through here. We got to make up our mind. I'm going to leave the place that is comfortable. I'm going to leave the place that is familiar. Even as the church, we're leaving comfort behind. We're leaving comfort behind. We're not interested in comfortable services. We're not interested in comfortable giving. We're not interested in comfortable serving. We're not interested in comfortable experience. We are getting beyond being comfortable, getting beyond being complacent, and saying, God, whatever it is you have for us on the other side of this thing, we're going to see it because I'm not staying here. I'm going to the other side. I've been here long enough. Many of us are so miserable, but we're still staying in the same place. Miserable, not because God's trying to do something for us. We're miserable because we're not where God told us to be. And we're wondering, like, God, when am I going to find peace in this place? And God says, never. Because that place is not the place where peace is. Peace is in my will, and it's in my plan, and it's on the other side of the mountain where you've set up camp, where you've set up resident. It's time. And listen, the next thing, some of y'all are going to like this one, it's time to break some things. Next thing I want you to write down, break some things. It said in verse 7, break camp and advance into the hill country of the Amorites. He said, break camp and advance. You cannot advance if you do not break camp. And a lot of us, we are wanting to advance in our lives, but we're not wanting to see anything broken. But if you want to advance, something has to break. If you want to go where God is leading you, something has to break. In order to advance, something has to break. He said, break camp in advance. You cannot advance in your horizons if you do not break your opinions. You cannot advance in your joy if you do not break your feelings. Some of us are so led by our feelings that we're staying in places that can never bring the joy that only God can bring. It says if you want to advance and see joy, you got to break your feelings a little bit. You cannot advance into your calling if you do not break your preferences. Some of us, our preferences are holding us back from God doing what he wants to do through our calling. It's like, I prefer to be able to sleep in on Sunday morning and get to church right at 9:59, which gives me time to get my coffee. The thought of serving and having to get there early at 9:15, 9:30 so that I can use my gift, a little uncomfortable. It's not really what I prefer. God's like, you want to advance in your calling. You want to use the gifts that I've given you, but you aren't willing to let go of your preferences. The only way to advance is to break something. Some of us, we gotta break something. Tell somebody, break something. Break something. Please wait until you get out of the building, but break something, you know? It says you've got to break these things in your life. They have to be broken. God told them, if you want to experience what I have, you got to break camp where you are. Oftentimes, God is breaking where we are to move us where we need to go. And it's not easy. See, this is the good thing about God. If you won't do it yourself, he loves you enough to come in and do it for you. But I promise you, if you'll just get up and do it yourself, it'll hurt a whole lot less. It'll be a whole lot easier. God says you need to break camp here so you can go where I'm leading you. And I have to ask this morning, have you settled in a place that you were supposed to pass through? Have you settled in a season that you were supposed to pass through? Have you settled in an environment that you were supposed to pass through? Some of us, we have settled in a job. And listen, we're like, hey, it pays well, it's good, but we never feel fulfilled. And we never feel purpose because we've settled in a place that was only supposed to be a bridge to get us to where God was taking us. And we've settled there, and we wonder, why at the end of every day am I miserable? Why do I feel unfulfilled? Why do I feel like my purpose, like my talents, like my giftings are not being utilized to their full potential? Because we've settled in a place we were supposed to pass through. A friend of mine's dad had been at the same job for 40 years. 40 years. Once again, longer than I've been alive. 40 years. And he had really grown as much as he could in that job. As you might imagine, in 40 years, I feel like there's only so far you can go in a job, in a career. He had grown as much as he could in this place for over 40 years at the Piggly Wiggly. 40 years. And he just felt like something wasn't fulfilled in his life, and he was struggling with it, but he just kept doing it because that's all that he knew. And so somebody came into his life on his job, and they told him, they said, listen, I have an opportunity for you for another business, like another place to work. I'd love for you to come and interview and just see. And he struggled with it because he had been in the same place for 40 years. Some of us, we've lived in the same place for 40 years, and the thought of leaving where we were for 40 years is scary. Some of us have been doing the same thing for 40 years. The thought of doing it differently is scary. So he had been there for 40 years. He struggled. It was a great opportunity. Finally, he decided, you know what? I'm going to do it. So he interviewed. He got the job. He got a company car to drive. He got $200 to pay for him and his wife's cell phone bills per month. He got insurance for he and his wife. And he also got a 6-figure salary. I'll find out. So he has all of this new stuff, and it's amazing, but this is what was so profound to me because it's amazing. But as his son was telling me this story, his son said, but you know what my dad said? He said, as amazing as all that was, he said, the thing I'm most excited about is I finally feel like I'm able to use my giftings to the fulfillment that God has given me. I finally have been released to do what I've been wanting to do all along. It wasn't about the money. Obviously, money helps. But it wasn't about the money, wasn't about the car, wasn't about any of that. It was about the opportunity to use what God had given him to be used in a greater capacity than it ever could have been. But if he would have stayed where he was comfortable, he never would have stepped into that God had for him. He never would have been able to experience that. He never would have seen the fullness of what God wanted to do in his life. But because he was willing to relinquish it and let it go, he saw the greater thing that God has. Because you will never truly have peace until you get where God is leading you. You will never truly have peace if you're in a place outside of where God has called you. If you are in a place that is less than what God has called you to. That does not mean, and I want to be clear on this, it's very important. It does not mean that where you are is bad. Many of us, we're just looking for bad signs, right? Like, oh, this thing is bad, so I know this is not where God wants me. Oh, this thing is uncomfortable, so I know this is not where God wants me. Sometimes it's good. Where we're at is good. Where we're at is good. I'm not saying where you're at is bad. I'm not saying that the relationship is bad. I'm not saying that the circumstance is bad. I'm just saying it's not where God has you. Just because it seems good doesn't mean that it is good. Just because it feels good doesn't mean that it is good. And we have to be careful that we don't take something that was supposed to be temporary and turn it into a lifetime. We have to be willing to go beyond the season and get to the place where God is taking us in the moment. And I know that's easier said than done because so often we're in this situation and it is difficult to tell the difference between the two because it's comfortable and it feels good and it feels safe. But God said, hey, you've got to break the place that you've set up camp. You've got to break the place that you're comfortable because here's what God knows. He knows that while it may be comfortable right now, he has the foresight, because he knows all things, to see beyond what you can see. So while it looks good now, while it looks good in Horeb, you've got the camp, you're all set up, you're not in a place to be able to handle the famine that's going to come. You're not in a place to be able to handle what's going to happen in the wilderness if you stay there. He says, I know more than you do. I see beyond what you see, and if you stay where you're at, it's not going to end well. It may be comfortable now, it may feel good now, but you've got to get beyond this thing to the place where I'm calling you to, because there is a purpose and a reason that I'm calling you. No word of God is wasted. No instruction of God is wasted. If he's leading you somewhere, there is a reason. If he's calling you somewhere, there is a purpose. It's not just because he's bored. There is a reason and there is a purpose. And God says, hey, you need to break some things so that you can advance into the place that I'm taking you. And then he said this in verse number 8. He said, see, I have given you this land. See, I have given you this land. This is the part where we stop. So often, this is the part where we stop so often. We're like, hey, I see what God has given me. God said, see, I've given you this land. That's where we stop. It's like, cool, I see it, God. I see the promised land. I see what you've given me. And we stop there, but he continues on. He says, see, I've given you this land. Go in and take possession of the land the Lord swore he would give to your fathers. Last thing I want you to write down today, if you're taking notes, is go in. Go in. He said, go in and take possession. If you do not go in, you cannot take possession. So it's great to see it from the outside, but if you do not go in, you're not going to experience what God has. And a lot of us, we're talking about what God's going to do. We're talking about the plans God has. We're talking about the breakthroughs he has. We talk about the things that he can do in our lives and how he's going to show up and how he's going to do this. We talk about all these things and we say we can see it, but have you gone in to take possession? It's not enough just to see it. It's not enough just to talk about it, but you got to go in. We're in the 4th month of the year. We're halfway through of this year. And I was thinking this week about how when the year started, I said, and stop me if you've heard this before, right? I said, I'm going to cut back sugar this year, and I'm going to work out more, right? I want to be around for a long time for my family. Told Nicole this morning, I'm like, hey, listen, I love you. Anything happens to me, you got a church that loves you too. You don't need a man. You'll be good. We got family. She got a big family. So I want to be around for a long time. So I try to cut back sugar and try to work out more and all these things. So it really wasn't like a resolution. It was a goal. Okay, because resolutions are made to be broken. So back all the way back in January, I set this goal that I'm going to work out more. You know how many times I've worked out? It's the middle of April. 0 times. 0 times. I'm working. Hey, it's not how you start. It's not about the middle. It's about how you finish. Come on, somebody. I got like 6, 7 months. We're going to be good. But how crazy would you look at me if I was complaining to you about how I don't have any muscle, right? Like if I was like, man, I just want to look like David Colquitt, worship leader up here, you know, like busting out of a shirt. If I'm complaining about like wanting more muscle, and you looked at me and you're like, well, why don't you work out? And I said, I do work out. And you were like, okay, cool. What kind of exercises do you do? Oh, I don't exercise. Okay, well, how are you working out without exercise? And I said, I go to the gym every day. You're like, cool, you go to the gym, that's fine. Like, what exercises do you do in the gym? I don't do exercises in the gym. What do you do when you go in the gym? I don't go in the gym. I go to the gym. And I told you, I drive by the gym every single day. And I'm frustrated because I'm not getting any muscle. You would look at me like I was crazy. Because you don't get muscle from driving by the gym. You get muscle from going into the gym. And as crazy as you would look at me, so many of us, we're so upset and distraught with God because we're not experiencing what he said, but he said, you haven't gone into the place I told you to go. You just keep looking at it. You keep talking about, well, I wish God would, and I wish I could see this, and I wish I could experience that. And God said, you're not going to experience it until you're willing to go in. Until you're willing to go into the place that I have called you to, until you're willing to go into the thing that I am leading you to. It's not enough just to see it. It's not enough just to talk about it. It's that you got to go in. You got to go in. God is saying if you want to experience, if you want to get unstuck, you have to leave where you are at and go into the place. If you want to get past that temptation that you keep giving into, you got to make up your mind. Listen, I'm not going to allow myself to get into the situation. I'm going to go into a place where I'm not in the midst of that temptation that I've been struggling to get past. You got to make up your mind. Listen, I'm done staying in the same place. I'm done doing the same things. I'm done experiencing the same stuff. I'm going to go into the new thing that God has for me. I'm done being stuck. You got to leave where you're at and go into the place that God is leading you to. Where you're at may be great. It may be comfortable. It may be amazing, like people would be jealous of you. But if it's not where God's leading you, then it's not where you're supposed to be. See, a lot of people, they're stuck with things that they can't really control, and we'll talk about that in this series. But the reality is, most of us, if we would step back and be honest and take a good, hard look at our lives, most of us are stuck because we've chosen to be. We're stuck in a place because we've chosen to be stuck. We're stuck in a mindset because we've chosen to have that mindset. We're stuck in insecurity because we've chosen to be insecure. Nobody told you that you had a reason to be insecure. You just took it on yourself. So now it dictates the decisions that you make. This was me for years. Insecurity ruled my life. Because I could walk into a room and I could tell something negative that every person would be thinking about me, even though I had never even met them. For years. Finally, God was like, if you're going to allow insecurity to rule your life, I'm not going to be able to ever let you fulfill your purpose to preach the word. If every time you get up, it's going to be insecure, you can't live that way. Many of us, we're living out things. We're stuck. Finally, I made a decision. You know what? I'm done. Because I'm not living for other people. I'm living for God. And if he is pleased, and if he sees something good when he looks down on this earth, that's all that matters. Many of us, we're not stuck because of other people. We're not stuck because people are forcing us to. We're stuck because we've chosen to be. And God's saying today, listen, it's time. It's time to leave the comfort. It's time to leave the laziness. It's time to leave the fear. It's time to leave the insecurity. It is time to leave the place that you're at because it was never meant to be forever. It's just a season. It's just a moment. May have been a long season. 40 years in a wilderness may have been a long time. But it wasn't meant to be forever. I have something new for you on the other side of this mountain.